Welcome to Curbside Chat. I am your host today, Emily Holtby, and this podcast is brought to you by the Automotive Industries Association of Canada, where I serve as Vice President, Government Relations. Curbside Chat offers insights from our on-the-ground experts into the dynamic and ever-evolving auto care sector, which is a huge part of Canada's economic engine, yet often overlooked and misunderstood. AIA Canada represents those in the sector, and we thank our sponsors for making this podcast possible. On today's episode, we're talking about something significant: our relationship with our friends to the south, the incoming Trump administration, tariff threats, and what all of this means for the Canadian auto care industry. Joining me today are two exciting guests. First, someone you know well, AIA Canada's President and CEO, Jean-François Champagne. And alongside him, we're thrilled to welcome Kate Harrison, Vice Chair at Summa Strategies, a leading public affairs and strategic communications firm based here in Ottawa. Welcome to you both. Donald Trump is returning to the White House. And following the 2024 election, Republicans have secured control of both the Senate and the House of Representatives, giving the party full control of federal power. During his campaign, Trump pledged to impose new tariffs on foreign imports as part of his America First agenda, aiming to boost domestic manufacturing and reduce reliance on foreign supply chains. Notably, in 2018, then President Trump imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum during the negotiations for CUSMA, otherwise known as the Canada-US-Mexico Agreement. And just last week, he announced plans for a new 25% tariff on all imports from Canada and Mexico, citing it as a response to border-related issues such as drugs and illegal immigration. So let's jump right in. And Kate, I'll start with you. Can you give us a quick overview of the situation and what are the true potential motives behind such a bold statement from the future president?
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Emily, for the question and for having me on. This is a situation where what's old is new. This is not totally dissimilar from some of the concerns that President Trump raised when he first came in 2016. So Canada has had to deal with this trade uncertainty and a changing dynamic in terms of the nature of our relationship. But there's a couple things that I think are a little bit this time. You spoke about kind of the mandate that President Trump was given in the recent election. So we will have at least certainly 2 years of a Trump administration that finds itself pretty unencumbered by House or Senate politicking that goes on. So some of the things that he has laid out as concerns, as you rightly pointed out in your intro, are the drug crisis and the migrant crisis. Things are developing all the time on this file. Just this past weekend, Prime Minister Trudeau went to Mar-a-Lago to meet with the president and a number of his advisors. He was joined by the public safety minister and his chief of staff to have a discussion about where they can find room to collaborate and perhaps dispel some of the misunderstanding that might exist between the role Canada plays in both of these problems and that of Mexico. Things are pretty fluid. It seems as though the president is at least interested in hearing Canada out and the proposals that we have, but inaction is not going to be an option. So the government is now looking at things like enhancing border patrol, drones, helicopters to try and have an impact both on the migrant side and the drug crisis side. I think in terms of the motives, it's being very clear about what they are. I don't think there's a hidden motive with Donald Trump. He tends to wear them on his sleeves. And so Canada needs to balance meeting that motivation on the part of the president and the desire to see action, while also trying to be firm about some of the facts, which is that, we are not responsible to the same degree as Mexico may be for the fentanyl crisis and the migrant crisis. So we have to marry that reality with demonstrating action to show the president that we understand his concerns and are meeting him in order to collaborate.
Well, that's very good overview. And so, JF, my question to you is, from an industry-specific perspective, when you first heard the announcement, what was your immediate concern that came to mind, especially given what we went through in 2018?
Yeah, well, frankly, my first reaction was, well, this is really typical negotiating tactics from President Trump. And I think we've come to know from him in his previous administration. That is how he's going to engage in negotiation, right? A very strong opening salvo with the goal of getting, the counterparts to offer concessions really early on into the negotiation. In fact, the Trump administration won't be in place until January 20th. So it's very early negotiation tactic in relations to files and focus for his administrations that are very important to him. And very much, as you said, Kate, I think it's going to be very clear, it's going to be very transparent about the issues he cares about and how he's going to engage to get some movement from the various counterparts to react and align with his own agenda. Well, so I'm not saying we shouldn't pay attention, but certainly the threat of tariffs in the automotive industry would have a very, very negative impact for Canada, but also for the U.S. And for Mexico.
And Kate, you reflected on this a little bit when we talked about the negotiations back in 2018, but you brought up the dinner that we saw on Friday night. That seemed like a new tactic. What worked really well for the Trudeau government last go round, and what didn't?
Well, I think one thing that worked very well was cross-partisan, bipartisan outreach, particularly to border members of parliament or border governors, representatives on the U.S. side from Canadian members of parliament. That was kind of a bipartisan effort. You saw the Liberals working across the aisle in order to do that. We find ourselves in a very different place politically. I think that, the nature of parliamentary collaboration has disintegrated. We're not going to have that same level of collegiality as we have our own kind of domestic political considerations and a pending election on the horizon. And the current government here in Canada has been in place for 9 years. So there's a number of folks who think that they ought to be the ones that are trying to now manage that relationship and perhaps repair what might have been broken. So certainly that bipartisan outreach and the border level outreach was very, very key. And I think the other part of that is, of course, just the economic reality of the integrated nature of auto in particular. When we're talking about wages, we're talking about supply chain, there are a lot of things that Canada and the US share and have in common. And when we are looking at, the betterment of the auto sector and the auto care sector, there is a lot of room to collaborate and work well together. I think it was to the credit of Canadian officials making the case on the integrated nature of that economy specifically that saw CUSMA have a number of benefits baked into it that are good for the North American auto market and the aftercare sector.
Absolutely. And I'm curious for JF to expand on this a bit. When we think about the automotive industry writ large, what role did it play in that final shaping of CUSMA?
Well, as Kate putting out, the auto care sector is a top contributor in terms of import and export between Canada and the U.S. So there was a lot of considerations to, as you said, Kate, the highly integrated nature of our industry, where, as a good example, parts that goes into the manufacturing of a new car may cross the border up to 7 times before ending up in a finished product. And so there's so much benefit to working collaboratively and so much integrations in this business that it's very critical that we continue to have an effective North American trade agreement. And we've seen that in the press now as a question of, well, this has become maybe a bilateral type of engagement between Canada and the U.S., where in fact we have very comparable wages and infrastructures as compared to Mexico. And this is something that we'll see as time goes on. And when we think about the impact on the auto care sector in terms of replacement parts that we use in our industry, this might be as critical in terms of integration, but it's very important for all the parts manufacturers here in Canada for sure.
Well, Jeff, maybe I'll stay on that with you for a second. When we talk about the potential impact of new tariffs or perhaps stricter rules of origin, how would these protectionist policies affect the Canadian automotive industry, particularly the auto care and parts sector? I'm just thinking about what type of vulnerabilities we're going to face.
Sure. Well, we know the tariffs would be very damageable to any Canadian-based manufacturers of replacement parts or chemicals that sells into the U.S. But even the manufacturers and the distributors who bring product into Canada from the U.S., well, as we explore, the consequences, potential consequences, we may have the possibility to see that these protectionism policies could cause the Canadian dollar to fall, so making it more expensive to import these products. So we need to be cautious that even if you're not in positions where you exporting into the U.S. and not be faced with those tariffs, the fact that you're doing business into the U.S. Importing product could very much have an impact. Specific to the rule of origin, as you ask, we need to ensure that renegotiation of the agreement would maintain a requirement for content from a North American perspective, or at very least U.S. Canada, and not introduce specific requirements for U.S. content that you may recall were an item of conversations through the last renegotiation back in 2018.
Well, you touch on that increased cost. And so, Kate, immediately that comes to mind is that consumer pricing, right? And the demand for auto care parts in Canada. Are there silver lining opportunities for our industry under the second Trump administration?
Well, I hesitate to call the current affordability crisis and cost of living crisis a silver lining, but the reality is, Emily, is, as you rightly note, cost is top of mind for consumers right now. You see drivers looking to extend the life of their vehicles as long as they can. They prefer to look to their local mechanics or local service and repair shops in order to have this work done. So certainly if we were faced with a dynamic where tariffs and retaliatory tariffs, we're seeing the increase in auto parts have a direct impact on consumer pricing to service these costs. There's a cost of living argument there. There's also a safety argument there. We don't want a scenario where drivers are putting off necessary repairs and servicing from the auto care sector in order to try and make ends meet or not face that affordability crunch. So there's a number of good reasons why we have to look at coming up with a trade dynamic that works for the auto care sector. But I would suggest that driver safety and the support for small businesses, including local repair shops, are chief among them.
Let's stay on that for a second. JF, Kate talks about that increased cost in housing, food, heating, gas costs. Ensuring a competitive auto care market is more important than ever. So how can the industry itself position itself to stay competitive, but also ensure that consumers aren't penalized?
Yes. Well, the fact is, the auto care sector has proven time and time again that it is a resilient industry that will always find new ways, new products, new technologies to remain competitive. Now, if you look from the consumer perspective, it is likely that costs to maintain a vehicle will simply go up as a result of these trade pressure. And unfortunately, ultimately, it is a consumer that would, again, bear the brunt of these measures. But this could also mean that buying a new vehicle will continue also to be expensive proposition. And we know that when vehicles are hard to get by or too expensive to buy, it drives the consumers to keep their vehicles longer. And as long as we in the auto care sector are able to service this vehicle, I think consumers will continue to invest, keep their car longer. And as you know, as a result, what we've seen through the pandemic now and continuing on through the pressure on pricing is that in fact consumers are in fact keeping their vehicle longer and making a positive impact on the auto care sector. But it's going to be ultimately the consumers, I think, is going to be faced with the increased costs as we have faced with those potential tariffs.
That's right. Okay. So I'm going to have one final question for you both, and this is a bit of a fun one because I'm going to ask you to look into a crystal ball. And it is President Trump's first day back in the office, and he's signing his famous executive orders. Do you think it'll be a 25% promised tariff across the board, or are we seeing the return of Trump's familiar negotiation tactics?
TJF, do you want to take that one first as resident psychic?
Well, I think we've almost forgotten the real roller coaster that we saw in the first Trump administration. But we need to be reminded that I think the second administration won't be the same as the previous one, simply because there were many voices of reasons in the inner circle, the entourage. I always think about John Kelly, his chief of staff. We were able to control a bit President Trump in its first administration. So without those people around him, I think we're going to see a lot more unpredictability. We're going to have to be able to react even more into an even more fast-changing environment. And you, Kate, you pointed out, there's going to be at least 2 years of the trifecta of the Congress and the presidency be on the Republican side. So I think we're going to see a lot of actions coming from this administration's out of the gate. And I think it's hard to predict. It's going to be very unpredictable for the first 24 months for sure.
I'd say the best defense against tariffs of 25% is a good offense on issues around fentanyl. It sounds as though even more so than the migrant issue, the fentanyl crisis and drug crisis is very concerning to the Trump administration. It's something that his vice president, J.D. Vance, spoke about numerous times during the election campaign. And obviously, given a bit about his story, is an issue of utmost importance. We've had a number of large busts of international fentanyl production facilities housed in Canada just in the last couple of weeks. So I think the answer to your question about whether or not we're going to have tariffs of that level depends very much on how quickly we can demonstrate progress on the border and on the fentanyl crisis specifically. I think that in many ways, Trump has given Canada notice, 60 days notice, to pull itself together, pull up its socks on the fentanyl issue. If we can demonstrate meaningful progress in that time, we might find ourselves dealing with, a lower tariff amount or at least a commitment to continue the conversation. But I really do think that these next 30, 60 days are really critical for Canada to get it right, set the relationship off at the right foot, to avoid some of these very punitive measures that would be damaging for the auto care sector and so many others.
Well, there you have it. You've heard it from the experts themselves. I want to thank you both so much for such an engaging and insightful discussion. It's clear that the road ahead for the Canadian auto care industry will be challenging, but with the right strategies, we can navigate these twists and turns. So I want to thank you for tuning in to Curbside Chat. Until next time.